Hey there, and thanks for joining us on Chicago Tonight Black Voices. I'm Brandis Friedman. Here's what we're looking at.
What does this mean for our community that's been suffering?
Allies of Mayor Johnson block a vote to transform a far south side vacant lot into a migrant shelter. What's next for this proposal? How the elimination of cash bail is going more than 1 month in. One-on-one with Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx. And wrongfully convicted people spend decades trying to get legal representation while incarcerated. We find out why it takes so long. Now to some of today's top stories. Mayor Brandon Johnson says he is joining the mayors of 4 other major cities heading to D.C. tomorrow, asking to meet with President Joe Biden over the migrant crisis. In a letter, the mayors of Chicago, Denver, Houston, and Los Angeles and New York say the migrants are arriving in their cities with little to no coordination, support, or resources from the federal government. With fewer available work permits, migrants aren't able to find work to pay for proper housing. Governor J.B. Pritzker today defended the state of Illinois' response in supporting Chicago.
And we've supported the city of Chicago with direct dollars to do that. We also have spent almost 3 times as much, 2 to 3 times as much as they have on all the wraparound services, including immigration lawyers, because it's important for us to get them the authorization so they can go to work.
And Heather Chiron will have the latest from City Hall on the migrant crisis in just a few minutes. A local budget watchdog says the city's proposed $16.6 billion budget for next year is on the right track. The Civic Federation says it supports Mayor Johnson's budget plan because it maintains the city's commitment to supplemental pension payments, avoids general tax hikes, and increases civilian positions in the Chicago Police Department. But the group raised concerns about an ongoing structural imbalance, as well as the growing cost of care for migrants, and proposed enhancements of pension benefits under consideration in Springfield. Illinois Senate Democrats are proposing a new district map for the future elected school board in Chicago. Leaders say this map consists of 20 proposed districts, 7 majority black, 6 majority Latino, 5 majority white districts, and 2 coalition districts. Senate Majority Leader Kimberly Lightford says the new map is a result of suggestions made by public and advocacy groups and better reflects the diversity of the city's neighborhoods. The deadline for lawmakers to have a final map is April 1st. Coming up in the program, Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx on the first month of no cash bail. But up next, Heather Chiron on the latest about plans for a migrant shelter on the far south side. Stay with us.
Chicago Tonight, Black Voices, is made possible in part by Fifth Third Bank and by the support of these donors.
At Fifth Third, we believe when diverse voices are heard and empowered, communities are made stronger, lives are made better, and the future holds greater promise for all. That's why we're proud to support Chicago Tonight Black Voices. Together, we can make a difference. Together, we can drive change.
A plan to transform a vacant grocery store and parking lot near 115th and Halstead into a migrant shelter ran into a buzzsaw of opposition Wednesday, forcing supporters to delay a planned vote. Mayor Johnson said he remains committed to getting the more than 2,800 people off the floors of police stations and the cold, wet concrete outside. He also pledged to keep working with the City Council on solutions. Heather Chiron joins us now with more. Heather, you've been following this, and the plan to buy the 67,000 square foot vacant former grocery store and surrounding 6.5 acres of land hit a brick wall after Alderman Ronnie Mosley said that he didn't want a migrant shelter in his ward. Here's what he told you before the meeting.
Our community came out and strongly said that this is not something that we want. So there's still a lot of reaction to that and a lot of questions. What does this mean for the project at that site? What does this mean for our community that's been suffering and is asking to take on more suffrage? How will we be made whole and how will we be made better?
Did his opposition turn the tide against this plan?
I think it did. There are a concerted group of older people, many of them who represent black wards that have seen decades of disinvestment, high crime, and grinding poverty, who want Mayor Johnson to take a new approach from top to bottom to his approach to the migrant crisis. As you know, the City Council also has a decades-long tradition of deferring to the local alderperson over high-profile, controversial projects like this. And so when Ronnie Mosley got up and said, my community does not want this and I cannot support it, that goes a long way with alder people because they think to themselves, what will happen if the mayor wants to put a migrant shelter in my ward where I don't want it? They want Alderman Mosley's vote, and that's why they gave them his vote today. Although mayoral allies were able to see how the tide was turning, blocked the vote, and will live to fight perhaps another day.
Okay, so it's been very cold this week, Heather. Does the city have a plan for, as you said, the more than 3,300 people who are sleeping on the floors of police stations and at O'Hare?
So reporters pressed the mayor, what does this mean? Is there a plan B? More than 2 months ago, he said that he would create these winterized base camps to get these people off the street before the weather turned. He said, look, he's going to keep working. The strategy remains the same, and that's why, as you reported, he's going to Washington, D.C. tomorrow to plead for not just cold hard cash, but more coordination at the border and more help sort of getting these migrants on their feet. Beyond that, there does not appear to be a plan B despite the weather.
So what's next for this proposal? As you said, wasn't there supposed to be a vote also on the Bring Chicago Home proposal today?
Today was a city council meeting where not a lot happened, but both of those proposals could come back for a vote on Tuesday at the City Council's next regular meeting. I feel it's certain that the Bring Chicago Home proposal will get a final vote, which could send it to voters in March. What happens with the proposal for the migrant shelter at 115th and Halsted, I think, is very much an open question at this moment.
Okay, more to come. Heather Chiron, thanks so much.
Thanks, Brandis.
And you can read Heather's full story on our website. That's WTTW.com/news. Up next, Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx on the elimination of cash bail. Stay with us. It's been more than a month since Illinois became the first state to eliminate cash bail entirely. According to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, a total of 649 detention hearings were requested in the first month, with detention being granted in 60% of those cases. Cases involving murder, vehicular hijacking, and attempted murder had the highest rates of detention requests, granted at 93, 94, and 89% respectively. Meanwhile, only 39% of domestic battery cases were granted detention. Joining us now with more on the first month without cash bail is Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx. Kim, welcome back. Thank you for joining us.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
So it's been more than a month since the elimination of cash bail in Illinois. Would you say it's meeting intended goals?
Absolutely. I mean, the intention was to make sure that people who pose a threat to public safety were able to be detained and people who didn't were released. And the numbers are telling us murder, attempt murder, vehicular hijacking, those people are being detained pre-trial, and we're seeing less people who are in the jail for nonviolent, low-level offenses.
So Cook County's jail population, according to your numbers as well, recently dipped below 5,000 for only the second time in nearly 4 decades. But we also know that drop in population in Cook County, it predates the law's implementation. What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, I think judges were preparing in anticipation of the Pretrial Fairness Act going into place September 18th. And so we were seeing those numbers dip. And then I think, again, we're seeing cases where people who were not going to be detained were not being held. And so those numbers, those low-level nonviolent offenses, those people are not languishing for even a day or two. So that's why that daily population is staying low.
What has it taken as far as sort of getting used to it for your staff with regards to training? Same thing with the rest of the criminal justice system and judges. And is it taking some getting used to?
It is. I mean, we've been preparing for almost 18 months before the implementation happened. I will say, and the people of Cook County should be really proud of the coordination and collaboration between our office, the public defender, the sheriff, the judiciary. And so, the first week with something so monumental and new, we knew we were going to see some rough spots. But overall, I think it has been relatively seamless given the gravity of what we're doing.
As we mentioned, domestic violence survivor advocates, they have said that the Pretrial Fairness Act would support survivors through various means. Numbers from your office, though, show that only 39% of those facing domestic violence charges were detained. Since domestic battery is often considered a misdemeanor, is there more that needs to be done to support those survivors?
I think what we also have to keep in mind is that even though that number is relatively low compared to the other cases, those are more cases of domestic battery people being detained than before. So historically, most of those, because they were considered misdemeanors, those defendants or those who were accused were able to go while posting bail. And so while it pales in comparison with those other cases, it is a significantly higher number of people who are being detained who are a threat to survivors than before. So certainly we want to make sure that when we're filing these detention hearings that we're doing that on behalf of our survivors who are asking for them and doing a good job of educating the judge as to why that person poses a threat to that victim and to the community.
Would you say that the judges are taking this as seriously and making adjustments the same way the rest of the criminal justice system has to do that?
Absolutely. And again, I think it's new. I think because historically these are cases that were considered to be misdemeanors or low-level violence, that judges are acclimating. And so we're seeing more petitions being filed, about a 20% more domestic violence cases that are coming in that are being asked for people to be held. And so I think we'll see a correlation in the number of those people being held going forward.
Of course, the law also allows for people who were currently being held in detention to request a hearing for a re-examination. What is the status of the detention review requests from detainees who were in the jail prior to the elimination of cash bail?
Certainly that's up to the public defender's office, who represents the bulk of the defendants in the jail. We also have the private bar, and we take them on a case-by-case basis. And so our assistants are looking at those requests, seeing if that person, what is the charge? Do we believe they pose a threat to public safety? In those instances, we will object to someone being released, but it's case by case. And largely we are seeing the defense bar and public defender being judicious in asking for those hearings. So we'll see, but we have not seen what people thought was going to be a run on people asking to be released. That has not come to play.
Does this legislation, does it pose any challenges that you hadn't anticipated, new realizations that were like, oh, we have to fix this now?
It's still early to tell, and certainly we are prepared to course correct anything that is in any way making our communities less safe or posing an onerous burden on survivors. We certainly want to address. But so far, we're meeting regularly, we're talking about sticking points. When we find that there are things that need to be re-examined, we're prepared to do so.
Some advocates for pretrial fairness for the act, they had been wary that judges would simply, rather than, of course, there's no cash bail, that a lot of folks would end up on electronic monitoring for those folks who were not being able to be held. Is your office seeing much of that? Is that still a concern?
I'm certain they're going to continue to look at that, but that hasn't borne out in any way. The numbers have remained relatively steady, and maybe a very slight dip in the number of people on electronic monitoring. And so I think we were gearing up and anticipating that that might be the offset. If you're not held in custody, then they'll put you on a bracelet. But the numbers thus far have not borne that out.
I think some people were also concerned that, if people were able to walk free, then they would be back out potentially committing other crimes.
Yeah.
Have other folks, have you had to press more charges on people who were already awaiting adjudication?
So far, that hasn't borne out. And keeping in mind it's only been about 5 weeks, but we have not seen an uptick in people who were released committing new crimes or people not returning to their court dates. And so I think, the fear-mongering that happened before this bill went into effect of the jails were going to be emptied and people were going to be running the streets is not borne out. What we have seen is that people who have posed a threat to public safety are now being detained, and as they should, and that people who are not a threat are allowed to go out and live their lives and come back and be held accountable. without having to use our jail resources.
Pivoting a little bit, we know that Illinois leads the country with the most exonerations in 2022, and you had an event on this earlier this month, or earlier in October, I should say. Data shows that the state still has a very high false confession rate. There's been some reports, from advocates of folks who are handling some of those old wrongful conviction trials that sometimes your office moves a bit slowly in getting back to them in court cases.
Yeah.
What would you say your office is doing to speed those cases up?
Yeah, I would certainly remind folks that for the last 5 years out of 6, Illinois has led the country in the vacating of wrongful convictions, largely by the work of our office. And we have, as you said, we have a long storied history with wrongful convictions, and re-examining these cases requires meticulous attention. And so it is slower because sometimes we're talking about cases that are 10, 15, 20, 30 years old and require a due diligence because in many instances we're talking about cases of murder. And there's a victim's family who wants to make sure that when we say we got it wrong, we in fact got it wrong. And so we are adding people to those roles, to the conviction integrity unit, to our post-conviction unit, rotating people in and out to get fresh perspectives on that, but making sure that we do our due diligence. We want to be expeditious, but we certainly want to be diligent in our efforts.
It's been a few months since Mayor Johnson has taken office, and a few weeks since a new superintendent of Chicago Police Department, Larry Snelling, has been in his job. How would you compare working to these two different leaders, former Mayor Lightfoot and former Police Superintendent David Brown?
Certainly Mayor Johnson is appreciative that we have to have a holistic approach to dealing with crime in our communities, that we need to deal with incidents as they happen, but we also need to invest in, the root causes of violent crime. And that narrative, that conversation is ongoing. And I believe him when he says that he's putting the whole of government to address violence in our communities. And Superintendent Snelling, I find, because he has a history of having worked in CPD for decades, that he understands the communities in which he serves, that he comes from the Englewood community, has a depth of understanding of the challenges, both externally and within CPD, that is different than a superintendent who comes from a different place. And so far it has been, and I anticipate it will be an ongoing, really robust, fruitful working relationship.
Okay, looking forward to it. Looking forward to having you back again. State's Attorney Kim Foxx, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, of course.
Up next, using technology to connect people in prison to legal representation. That's in a conversation recorded earlier. Stay with us. More than 3,300 wrongfully convicted people have been exonerated since 1989. That's according to the University of Michigan's National Registry of Exonerations. And that time on the inside adds up to more than 30,000 years unjustly spent in prison. For many of those people, a significant number of those years were spent trying to find legal representation to make a case for their exoneration, a process that is complicated, difficult, and above all, lengthy. Joining us now are Michelle Mbecchiani, Senior Legal and Policy Advisor for Justice Reform in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. She's also the founder and CEO of Period, a platform that connects people in prison with legal representation. Terrell Swift, an exoneree wrongfully convicted for 15 years and Period Advisory Board Chair. And wrongful conviction attorney Laura Nyrider. Thanks to the three of you for joining us. Michelle Mbecchiani, in Illinois, how are people going about finding legal representation while incarcerated?
Well, to many surprise, they're relying solely on snail mail. Currently, we're seeing that a lot of individuals who are currently incarcerated either find an attorney from word of mouth or family member reaching out to an attorney. For those who do not have that connection to the outside, they send letters, oftentimes sending dozens, hundreds of letters, blind cold calling essentially to find an attorney to review their case. In that process, they're writing letters telling them about their case, but oftentimes attorneys are not informed of the information that's necessary to, one, identify who they are in the system. There are a lot of Robert Smiths of the world. Two, what their issue is to be addressed. And three, how to move forward with family members on this particular issue. That takes a lot of time, a lot of staffing, and it's very costly and time consuming for those who are incarcerated.
Terrell, you were one of the so-called the four Inglewood teenagers, once upon a time called the Inglewood Four, wrongfully convicted for 1994 rape and murder in 1998. Can you describe what was your experience when you were incarcerated trying to find that representation?
It was a long battle. Again, I started my quest of writing attorneys and seeking help in 1998, and I didn't get anyone to really take my case until 2009, and I was scheduled to be released in 2010. So it was a long process, and I'm thinking, like, back then that was a 10, 12-year process for me back then. With the advancement of technology nowadays, you can probably add another 10, 15 years on top of the 10 I did in terms of someone trying to get help today with a message in a bottle writing or snail mail, as Michelle just, as she put it.
Laura Nyrider, the U.S. prison population stands at 2.3 million. Some studies estimate between 2 and 10%, which, it's a big difference right there, 8% to be specific. But between 2 and 10% of them are wrongfully convicted, which would mean about 46,230 people, or 46,000 to 230,000 people. Are there enough attorneys in the world working on wrongful convictions to make a dent in those kind of numbers?
We can never have too many people working on the problem of wrongful convictions, right? We know right now of over 3,000 cases of people who've been exonerated, many losing decades of their lives. And these are folks who have sent the proverbial message in a bottle, write letter after letter after letter to attorneys, journalists, whomever they hope will listen. Right now, there's about 72 innocence organizations across the planet. That's on the globe, only about 72, many of which are staffed with 2 attorneys here, 3 attorneys there, 4 attorneys there, a lot of them nonprofits, some of them housed at universities. This is a tremendous start, a tremendously powerful, dedicated, committed group of advocates, but the numbers of lawyers out there are small, and the demand, unfortunately, for this kind of legal representation is way too high.
Michelle, what are some of the other barriers for the wrongfully imprisoned when they're trying to get back into the courtroom?
I mean, one of the things that we tend to take for granted is just the cost to send out a letter. To give an example, in the state of New York, in their prisons, you get 1 stamp every 5 days. And it can be no more than 1 ounce. So essentially, an individual incarcerated trying to get at least one person to listen to their story has 6 pages to put all that information in. That's just to get your story out. I've heard stories of individuals incarcerated who would forego commissary and eating just to get as many letters out as possible, oftentimes saying you just need one person to listen. But in that pursuit of one person to listen, it oftentimes takes up to a decade or even more. So that's just the kind of the cost side for individuals incarcerated.
Terrell, once you did connect to legal help, what was that like when you were communicating with your legal team?
In terms of what was it like, and
how did you communicate with them, and what was that next process, the next part of the process like?
It was, for me, it was when you're, wrongfully convicted and you're reaching out for someone to listen, right? We just want someone to listen and hear our voice. And once I finally got that representation, I had that voice to be in front of the courtrooms, because that's what I needed. I needed someone to hear my story and be my voice in front of this courtroom, because I can tell you legally what they did, but it was wrong. But it was definitely a long process, but it was gratifying. It's gratifying when you get that help, because you're fighting years and years and years for someone just to listen.
The heartbreaking thing about the practicing as an innocence attorney at so many different organizations around the country, there are backlogs of hundreds, if not thousands, of letters, pieces of paper torn out of a notebook, handwritten letters that come in from states all across the country, sometimes from other countries. And just the mere task of sorting through that mail and being able to correspond and much less engage with the facts of every case and get to know each person as the human being that they are is an enormously daunting task for for wrongful conviction attorneys.
I imagine it also indicates that there are far more people wrongfully convicted in prison than we know. Michelle, we mentioned that you're launching a digital platform to circumvent some of these barriers that we've been talking about, the Period app. Briefly, because we're almost out of time, tell us how that works, please.
Essentially, it's that digital platform for legal correspondence, and it addresses the finding an attorney and matching with an attorney. For the person who's incarcerated, it helps them, one, find the attorney, the universe of attorneys that can take on their case, inform the attorney of necessary information to assess their case, and gives them feedback on whether they're going to take on the case. For the attorneys, which is the hugest value proposition, one, it helps them find those clients that are trying to reach out to them in a fast manner, to be informed on what the information they need on their case, also to review that information and respond to them in a timely manner. Essentially what Period does is minimizes the costly and again more timely administrative intake tasks so we can expedite that process for them to fight for the clients.
Okay, it's almost kind of like dating, but for
So actually that
wrongfully
was
incarcerated attorneys.
That's the exact user experience that I use, which is familiar and user friendly because people know how to navigate that. So how can I adapt that so it's easy for attorneys to navigate that? That's very more intuitive.
Okay, that's where we'll have to leave it. Best of luck to you, and thanks for joining us, Michelle and Becchiani, Terrell Swift, and Laura Nyrider. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Back with more Chicago Tonight Black Voices right after this. And that is our show for this Wednesday night. Join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and 10 for Chicago Tonight Latino Voices. A look at the conditions migrants face as temperatures drop. Medical professionals and volunteers weigh in. And the legacy of Danny Sotomayor ahead of the next episode of Chicago Stories, focusing on the late Chicago AIDS activist. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight Black Voices, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe. Have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm dedicated to preserving the dignity and rights of all individuals.